Thank you, and good morning, everybody. Let's just remind ourselves what we're talking about here. That's enough of that. Right. What we're looking at is revisiting the Gospel of St. Matthew and asking ourselves, well, we know the account, the Magi visiting the Christ Nativity, having seen a star in the east. We're going to ask ourselves, are there any astronomical candidates? In other words, could we possibly explain what the Star of Bethlehem actually was based on our understanding of what was actually in the sky? And we'll be asking ourselves, do the dates match up? Given that we can work out what was in the sky in a given year in the past, do any of the things that appear in the sky match up with the timeline of the Nativity? And at the end, I'll show a little simulation of what the night sky looked like so we can get an idea of what might have been the Star of Bethlehem. And then I'll summarize. Hopefully all of that in half an hour, if I get the timing right. So let's remind ourselves what it is we're trying to explain. The principal elements of the Gospel according to St. Matthew, I've highlighted the particular important aspects in red. So the Magi journeyed to Jerusalem prompted by a star in the east. Bear in mind they didn't follow the star in the east, they headed west. They saw a star in the east and headed west. So the first thing we have to understand is what could have been the star in the east. They asked Herod when they got to Jerusalem, what's this we hear about the birth of the King of the Jews? And Herod wasn't really aware of what it was they were talking about. And so the Magi journeyed on to Bethlehem, where the star reappeared in the sky and then stopped in the sky over Bethlehem. So those 5 aspects in red, the appearance of a star in the east, the fact that it somehow signified the birth of the King of the Jews, the fact that Herod didn't seem to know what they were talking about, the fact that the star reappeared and then stopped in the sky. If we can find an astronomical candidate that meets those 5 criteria, then maybe we've identified the Star of Bethlehem. Okay, let's just remind ourselves about the lyrics to this wonderful carol, We Three Kings. Just listen to the words for the first verse. Join in if you like. Many of us are perhaps familiar with the lyrics, and over the years, the lyrics of We Three Kings have become confused with the actual account. Because when we actually look at what the Bible says, the Bible doesn't talk about the 3 wise men, or the 3 kings, or the 3 magi. Nowhere does it say how many people visited Jesus. It's assumed there were 3 because of the number of gifts that are specified. The 3 gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. So if there were 3 gifts, it was assumed that there were 3 people visiting, as opposed to 20 people visiting, 17 of whom said, I didn't know we were supposed to bring gifts. So the 3 isn't actually accurate, that's just a guess. So we shouldn't really talk about the 3. And where did it get kings from? The Bible talks about the 3 magi, or the 3 wise men. Nowhere does it specify that they are kings. So we ought to eliminate that from the carol as well. Where did they come from? The Bible doesn't say. It might have been Persia, it might have been India, it might have been further east. We don't know. So unless you take the Orient as meaning somewhere where we haven't got a clue where they came from, we shouldn't talk about any particular geographic location. And when they saw the star in the east, they didn't follow it. They saw the star in the east and went in the opposite direction. So they didn't follow the star in the east. So we should get rid of that as well. So you can see this Christmas carol is rapidly falling to pieces. And I'm a scientist, I'm a physicist, and I like accuracy and I like precision. So I don't like any Christmas carol that doesn't cover the facts. So I think it ought to be reworded to be factually correct. So it really ought to be, we, indeterminate number of men of unspecified geographic origin, saw a star. Now, that doesn't meter quite as well as We Three Kings. So now you can see why physicists don't write Christmas carols. But bear in mind also, we should not talk about 3 wise men. It should simply be n wise men, where n is a number bigger than 1 and less than infinity. It's bigger than 1 because magi is the plural of magus, and therefore there were more than one of them, and the gender was male. So there were wise men, but we don't know how many. Okay, so we're not doing so well on the carol, but okay, we're trying to look at the account in the Bible rather than the Christmas carol, but the two do often get confused. We have to remind ourselves as to what we mean by a star, because a star doesn't mean a star in the sense that we understand it today, a star like our sun, for instance, because planet is a word that means wandering star. So in other words, a star that moves in the sky is what we would now call a planet, but originally they were called stars. And similarly, comets were often called broom stars or hairy stars. In other words, it's something that appears in the night sky. It doesn't look quite like the other fixed stars. It seems to have a tail, and we now call them comets, but they were called hairy stars. And of course, we still call meteors shooting stars. That's still a colloquial phrase that we often use. So star can mean almost anything. Basically, it means something seen in the night sky, other than the things we definitely know about, like the moon, for instance. Anything else seen in the night sky could be assumed to be a star of one kind or another. We mustn't fixate on the fact that it has to be a star in the modern sense of our understanding of star. Do we get any clues by looking at artistry of the adoration of the Magi? Well, quite often the Star of Bethlehem is somewhere there in the background, shining its radiance down onto the baby Jesus. But not surprisingly, artists' impressions that were, of course, painted many, many centuries after the Nativity, it's no surprise that we don't get much information from that. Here is Botticelli's version of the Adoration of the Magi. There's Joseph at the back, looking very bored, not taking any part in the celebration, apparently. Perhaps that's appropriate, as allegedly he took no part in the conception either, so maybe that's appropriate. And we see lots of different ways. Only Giotto actually indicated that the Star of Bethlehem might have been a comet rather than a star. Virtually everybody else depicts it as a star in the conventional sense. This one from Rubens, I couldn't actually see a star in the background. All we have in the background appears to be a two-headed camel. Apart from that, that's all we can judge. So what about the astrological significance of what's seen in the sky? Well, every planet, every star, every constellation had some, or arguably has some, astrological significance. For instance, we can think of Venus as a planet in the sky, but astrologically, the appearance of Venus is related to beauty, it's related to fertility, it's related to birth via mythology. Similarly, Jupiter, being one of the brightest stars, one of the brightest planets in our sky at the moment, one of the brightest stars in antiquity, is often associated with royalty. It's often called the king of planets. Regulus is a bright star in the constellation of Leo, and as you can perhaps guess from the first 3 letters of the word Regulus, it's related to kingship as well. It's often known as the king of stars. And Leo, because virtually every culture seems to recognize the constellation of Leo as outlining a lion, regardless of what name you give it, the constellation of Leo is often associated with the Lion of Judea, because the flag of Judea has a lion on it, and therefore the constellation of Leo is often associated with the land of Judea and the tribe of Judea. So why do people assign astrological significance to what they see in the sky? Well, because it was believed that that's where you find out what mankind has in store. In other words, is the crop going to fail next year? Are we going to have a flood? Are we going to have a famine? Are we going to have an earthquake? All of this information is posted on the sky. Basically, God uses the sky as his Facebook page. And therefore, if you look at the sky, you can tell what God has in store for mankind. That is what was believed, perhaps a few people still do, that that's how you read the sky. So astrology was very important to work out what's going to happen in the near future. So what possible candidates do we have? What possibilities exist? Let's have a think about the possibilities and see how they match up to these 5 criteria that I highlighted in the Gospel according to St. Matthew. In other words, could it be interpreted as a star in the east? Could it have been significant? Is there a reasonable explanation as to why Herod wouldn't be aware, even though the Magi apparently saw this in the sky? Is it possible that this would reappear in the sky, and is it possible that it would stop in the sky? If we consider the first possibility, what about a shooting star? Is it possible that the Star of Bethlehem was a shooting star, or a set of shooting stars, a meteor shower? Doesn't seem to fit the facts, because meteors appear all over the sky, not just in the east. There's no particular significance to them, because meteor showers come and go, and there's quite a few showers during the year and essentially every year, so there's no particular significance to them appearing. Yeah, Herod would not be aware of any significance because there wouldn't be any particular significance. Could a meteor shower reappear in the sky? Yeah, meteor showers come and go all throughout the year, but that's why they're relatively insignificant. Can a meteor shower stop? Well, not really, in the sense that a meteor streaks across the sky, and the idea of the star stopping in the sky doesn't seem to fit. So meteors don't seem to fit the bill. What about the appearance of a comet? Well, a comet could appear in the east, for sure. It would be significant. If it was a bright comet with a big tail, that would be considered a significant event. They don't necessarily come around that often with very bright tails. But if it was very bright and very significant, when they went to Jerusalem and said, "What's this we see about a sign in the sky about the birth of the King of the Jews?" Herod didn't seem to be aware of the fact that there was a bright comet in the sky. Now, Herod didn't actually have very good eyesight, but he would have had a whole court of astrologers to tell him that something had appeared in the sky, but he didn't seem to be aware of that. A comet can reappear in the sky. Comets go around the sun, and for a while they can go behind the sun and disappear from sight and then reappear on the other side of the sun. So a comet can reappear in the sky. There's argument as to whether a comet can stop in the sky. Generally speaking, comets are going around the sun, so they're continuously in motion. Under very special circumstances, it might be possible for the orbit of the comet to be such that the comet appears to come towards the Earth and might appear to stop moving relative to the background stars for a while. So that cross at the end maybe should be a question mark instead. What about a nova, a new star appearing in the sky? Novas occur every once in a while. A bright nova, a nova that's bright enough for the astrologers to say that star wasn't there last week and now there's a star in that position there. The brightness of stars can go up and then fade away over days or weeks or months. So yes, it is possible for a nova to occur in the east, and if it's bright enough, it would be significant. But if it was bright enough, again, why wouldn't Herod be aware of that? Could it reappear in the sky? Well, generally speaking, a nova, a brightening of a star, once it's faded away, it won't brighten again for perhaps decades later, maybe even hundreds of years later. So the idea of the star brightening again a few months later, or less than a year later, doesn't seem very likely. And why would you talk about a star stopping in the sky? If the star is a nova, it's the same as the other fixed stars. The sky appears to move as the Earth rotates, but all of these stars that appear to be moving are fixed in their relative positions according to the constellations, and so a new star that appears would be moving with all of the other fixed stars. So why would you say the star stopped in the sky? That doesn't seem to make any sense. And a supernova, a star blowing itself to pieces, that will happen every once in a while. It's effectively, as the name suggests, looks like a very bright nova. It can be spectacularly bright. It can be visible in daylight if it occurs for a star not too distant away from Earth. But again, we have the same problem. It could appear in the east. It would be significant. but why wouldn't Herod be aware of it, and why would you ever describe a supernova as stopping in the sky? Because it would be fixed relative to the other stars. But there is one candidate which is gaining some favour, and that is a conjunction, an alignment of different planets. The planets will be going around the sun, doing their own thing, going around the sun in a particular time period. Every once in a while, two planets seem to get close together in the sky. And if every planet has a particular significance, then when two planets get close together in the sky in a particular constellation, then the astrologers can assign some significance to that event. The alignment of planets can occur in the east. It can be significant depending on how you interpret it. Herod and his astrologers might have interpreted it differently, so that might be why Herod wasn't aware of the birth of the King of the Jews. An alignment of planets can occur more than once, as we'll see shortly, and it is possible for a planet to stop in the sky. So it ticks all the boxes. Just to make sure that you're happy with this idea of planetary conjunctions, if we imagine two hypothetical planets going around the sun, planets that are closer to the sun go round faster, and they've got less distance to travel. So you can see that in any particular chunk of sky, two planets might appear to be quite widely spaced, or they might appear to be in the same direction, depending on where you're viewing them from. So that means that when you're looking at the planets, they generally speaking will be spread across the sky, but they move at different speeds. The more distant planets will move slowly, the closer planets will move more quickly, and hence every once in a while they'll get close to each other. The other thing to bear in mind is that because of the inner planets moving much faster than the outer planets, if we imagine the green planet here is Earth and the red planet is Mars or Jupiter or Saturn, some of the outer planets, because Earth is moving faster, Earth can overtake these outer planets on the inside track. Most of the time, the planets are moving from west to east across the sky. If you look south, they're moving from the right towards the left. But every once in a while, because the Earth is on the inside track, every once in a while, in this situation here, in the middle, that planet is still moving at its normal speed, but the Earth is moving faster, which means, what does that planet appear to be doing? It is moving from right to left, but because the Earth is moving faster, the planet appears to move backwards for a while. If we look at how that planet moves on the sky, it moves from west to east, but every once in a while it will stop in the sky, start moving backwards, stop again, and then continue moving west to east. The planet itself is just going round the sun at a constant speed, but because the Earth is overtaking it on the inside lane, the appearance, let's run that animation one more time, the appearance is the planet appears to stop in the sky, move backwards for a while, stop again, and then move forwards. We'll see that in just a second. Let's just look at the timeline. So here I've got the timeline of a few years BC. Bear in mind, there was no year zero. If anybody has a look at a sort of planetarium software or an app and wants to see where the planets were in years gone by, bear in mind some software does not correctly account for the fact that there was no year zero. We go directly from 1 BC to 1 AD. Bear that in mind if you're looking at an app. When was Christ born? Well, we don't know. A lot of people seem to think Christ was born perhaps between 4 and 8 BC, according to our current calendar. That's mainly based on when we think Herod died, because Christ was not born after Herod died. But there are a number of different scholars, I'm not amongst them because I don't study the Bible, but people who've studied the Bible and studied records believe that maybe the death of Herod has been misdated. When you look at the records, it doesn't say Herod was dead in 4 BC, for obvious reasons. It said Herod died in the year of the flood that came after the eclipse, which came after the famine, which came after whatever. There's a whole series of events. It is thought that the eclipse that refers to when Herod died, people have actually assigned the wrong eclipse, and actually Herod died a little later than that. So some people believe that Christ was actually born somewhere around 1 to 3 BC rather than 4 to 8 BC. The bottom line is we cannot be sure. What about things that we know happened on that timeline? We know there was a comet around in 12 BC. We know that fairly reliably because that was Halley's Comet. Halley's Comet has been seen quite a few times. We know precisely how long it takes to go around the sun, and so we can just wind the clock backwards and work out that, yes, Halley's Comet was in the sky in 12 BC. But isn't that a little early for God to be posting on Facebook that something interesting is going to happen? So it doesn't seem like Halley's Comet was the Star of Bethlehem. Two other comets, I know they look like meatballs in this particular icon, but two other comets appeared around 5 BC and 4 BC. The first comet is Comet Holmes. This came round not so long ago. If you're not astronomers, you probably don't realize that, but back in 2005, Comet Holmes came around, and we can wind the clock back and work out that Comet Holmes was in the sky at that point. In 4 BC, that was Comet Churyumov-Gerasimenko, a really long name for a comet. That was the comet that was visited and landed on by the little Rosetta spacecraft and Philae lander when they actually landed on the comet. But both of those comets are relatively small and do not generate long tails. So back in 4 and 5 BC, they would not have been a spectacular sight. So it doesn't look like any of those comets work. They work as far as timing, but not as far as being a spectacle. Nova, well, the Chinese saw a nova in 5 BC, and the Koreans saw a nova in 4 BC, a new star that appeared in the sky. Nova don't come along that often. A naked eye nova, remember this is long before telescopes, so the idea of a star brightening sufficiently to be visible with a naked eye, you wouldn't expect that to happen many times in a century. So are we just lucky that two came along 1 year apart? Well, possibly not a year apart. One says late 5 BC, the other says early 4 BC. It's probably the same object, and we've just got our dates ever so slightly confused, because it is difficult to date things from 2,000 years ago. So it was probably a nova around about that time, and the Koreans and the Chinese both saw the same object. But we've already said that nova don't seem to fit the bill particularly well. And we're left with conjunctions. There was definitely an interesting conjunction. I'm using the astrological symbols here for brevity. That thing that looks like a curly 4 stands for Jupiter. The H with a line through it is Saturn, and you're probably more familiar with the symbol for Venus. So there was a conjunction between Jupiter and Saturn around 6 BC, and some people think that particular conjunction might have been the Star of Bethlehem. It's the same conjunction that happened a couple of years ago, again around December time. But I think that one is much more interesting. It only works, of course, if Herod did die a little later than some people believe. But if we assume that Christ could have been born around 2 BC, then this conjunction of Jupiter and Venus, rather than Jupiter and Saturn, proves to be very interesting. And we can use a little bit of software just to show us how the stars and planets were arranged in the sky. I've taken some software and dialed the clock back. I know you can't read this, especially from the back. I've dialed the clock back to August of 3 BC. I don't know where the Magi were to observe the sky. I don't know if they were Persia or India or Outer Mongolia. So I've simply said, roughly speaking, from somewhere around the middle of the Earth, where were the planets in the sky? The argument as to whether you would see something slightly different from different parts of the Earth, well, on the scale of the distance to the planets, getting your geography slightly wrong doesn't make that much difference. So I'm looking at a patch of sky that includes the constellation of Leo, and the brightest star in Leo is Regulus, the king of stars, and there I've labeled the planet Jupiter. I am not going to label all the other planets, because then you get lots of labels flying around and it gets very difficult to see what's going on. So let's run the clock forward a few days at a time from August 3 BC, and we're going to observe what happens to Jupiter, and coming up behind it, this other bright object here is Venus. So if we run the simulation, in August, Venus and Jupiter get very close in the sky. Venus is a very bright planet, and Jupiter is often the second most bright planet. So the two brightest planets in the sky have got close together. Not right on top of each other, but they are quite close. They are closer together than the full moon, for instance. it's very unlikely that two planets will ever cross each other directly in terms of our line of sight, because all the planets are in slightly different orbits that are all tilted relative to each other. They're not all orbiting in exactly the same plane. So they usually miss each other when they go round the sun in terms of the point of view as seen from the Earth. In this case, they were quite close together, so you had two very bright points of light very close together in the sky. Much brighter than, for instance, the conjunction we saw a couple of years ago between Jupiter and Saturn, as Saturn is nowhere near as bright as Venus. So what we have here is a bright star, as in a conjunction of two planets, visible in August of 3 BC, and that conjunction would have been visible in the early morning before sunrise. It would have been a star in the east, and it would have been a significant one because what's happening? Venus is in conjunction with Jupiter in the constellation of Leo. Venus, birth, Jupiter, king, Leo, the land of Judea. So that astrologically signifies birth of the king of the Jews. And it's a star in the east. That would have got the astrologers interested. Then they continued watching the sky. What happened in the next few months? Venus continues to move on because Venus is moving quite fast. Jupiter moves past Regulus. The king of planets moves past the king of stars. And as Jupiter orbits and the Earth overtakes it on the inside lane, Jupiter appears to stop in the sky. It no longer moves from west to east. It stops and starts moving from east to west. And as Jupiter starts moving backwards, it goes back towards Regulus again. And it passes Regulus a second time. We're now in the spring of 2 BC. Now that the Earth has finished overtaking Jupiter, Jupiter stops in the sky and then continues to move from west to east as it did before. So Jupiter now goes past Regulus a third time. So the king of planets has passed the king of stars, not once, not twice, but 3 times in succession. One king appears to be handing over to another king. Something interesting is happening. The birth of the king of the Jews, and there's going to be one king passing to another. Jupiter's been doing this whilst Venus has been going around the sun, and Venus is now reappearing and is coming in fast from the right. And Venus and Jupiter are going to be in conjunction again. The star has reappeared. The conjunction has occurred a second time now in the summer of 2 BC. And this is a very close conjunction. This isn't just 2 points of light getting close in the sky and then separating again. This is 2 points of light getting really, really, really close. How close did those get? Let's zoom in. Let's center up Jupiter. Now, there's no telescopes 2,000 years ago, but let's pretend we had a telescope and zoom in to see just how close Jupiter and Venus were in the sky. You can't get an awful lot closer than that. They were so close. This is a field of view which is much, much, much smaller than any human could possibly resolve. So nobody on Earth would have seen this as 2 points of light when they got that close. The bright Jupiter and the bright Venus would have got so close together they would appear to merge as one very bright object. This, almost certainly, the astrologers would never have seen before. I don't know exactly how often you would expect this to happen. I'd be surprised if it happens more often than a few times every millennium. And so the astrologers, having seen this merge of the 2 brightest planets in the sky into one very bright object, would have seen this as extremely significant and would have then hot-footed it over to Jerusalem. So here's a reminder of what we've just said. In August of 3 BC, Jupiter and Venus are close, not spectacularly close, but quite close in the sky. Venus birth, Jupiter king in the constellation of Leo, the land of Judea, birth of the king of the Jews. They then watched the sky for the next few months and saw the king of stars get passed by the king of planets. Jupiter goes past Regulus 3 times in the next few months. Sounds like a king is moving on and passing the crown to another king. And then in June of 2 BC, we get this spectacular conjunction of Venus and Jupiter that are so close they cannot be resolved as two different objects but merge. That would have been the starting pistol telling them to go to the land of Judea and give homage to the new king. How long did it take them to get there? No idea. We don't know where they came from. We don't know whether they were starting in Persia or India or Outer Mongolia. We don't know if they were walking. According to the Christmas cards, they were on camels, but who knows if they actually had camels or whether they were walking. So we got no idea if it took weeks or months for them to get to Jerusalem. It's interesting to note that if you say, well, it must have taken them at least quite a few months, it's interesting to note that in December, Jupiter again stops in the sky. It's tempting to say, well, was it possible that they got there 6 months later, and when they got there, they noticed that Jupiter, which they had seen earlier in conjunction, Jupiter stopped in the sky. On which date does Jupiter stop in the sky in December of 2 BC? It's actually the 25th of December. Now, that's just an entire coincidence, because we know that the 25th of December is just an old pagan festival, Saturnalia, that was taken over by the Christians. So it's just coincidence that Jupiter happens to stop in the sky on the 25th of December. So that I found interesting. It's by no means proof, it's just interesting that if you look at that particular conjunction, it seems to fit the various elements of the account. So maybe it was those conjunctions of Jupiter and Venus, twice, one close call, one extremely close call of a conjunction over a period of many months, as well as Jupiter passing Regulus. Maybe those various conjunctions inspired Matthew to weave that narrative into the gospel written sometime after the Nativity. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was one of the other events that I've sort of said I don't think so. Maybe it was a comet or something else. Maybe it was a combination of events that made people think about the Star of Bethlehem. We can easily work out the astronomical facts. It is easy, in principle, to calculate where Jupiter was in the sky 2,000 years ago. We can do that with phenomenal accuracy. We can work out, for instance, when an eclipse of the moon or the sun is going to occur. We can do that 10,000 years in advance if we want to. So working out where the planets were is easy. Working out how bright a comet might be is a little more tricky, because comets, they're a bit unpredictable. So in other words, they're like cats. They've got tails and they're unpredictable. We can't predict how bright they're going to be or how bright they were. But the facts are easy to work out. Jupiter was in the sky and was in conjunction with Venus on that day at that time in the morning. We know that as a fact, effectively. But second-guessing the significance that the Magi or any astrologer would have applied to an appearance of that particular conjunction, that, of course, is a different matter. That is pure speculation, because we are assuming that they saw this and would have thought it was significant. But regardless of whether or not that was the Star of Bethlehem or not, the underlying message, of course, is the same. I hope you all have a very peaceful New Year and Christmas. Thank you.